A child solved this, he laughed. But when the maid's daughter stopped the billion-dollar tower from tearing itself apart, his smirk vanished. A maid's daughter solved this. Khalid Alahim's laughter echoed through the glass boardroom like a thunderclap. His cufflinks glittered under the Dubai sun as he pointed at the trembling tower model on the screen. Three global firms have failed me. And you think a child has the answer? Chloe Hayes sat silent, her sketchbook balanced on her knees, every eye in the room burning into her small frame. Executives smirked. Investors whispered in Arabic, and her mother shrank with shame beside her. Then Khalid leaned in, voice low but venomous. Fine, prove it. Solve the mystery that has humiliated the greatest minds on Earth, and I'll pay you $100 million. Fail, and you'll never set foot in this tower again. The room froze. The hum of the building vibrated through the walls like a heartbeat. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. A building doesn't have a soul, but it does have a voice. This one was screaming, and in the heart of the glittering desert, in a city built on impossible dreams, only a child was quiet enough to hear it. The Oasis Tower was more than a building. It was a statement. It rose from the Dubai sands like a shard of polished obsidian, a twisting spear of glass and steel aimed at the heavens. It was the tallest, most luxurious, most technologically advanced residential tower on Earth. It was Khalid Al-Fahim's monument to himself. At 52, the billionaire developer had a reputation carved from granite and ambition. He had conquered markets in London, Tokyo, and New York. The Oasis was his crowning achievement, a project so audacious that other developers had called it impossible. Khalid thrived on the impossible. The tower housed the world's wealthiest people. Its penthouses sold for 9 figures. Its lobbies were decorated with art that belonged in museums. The very air inside was filtered, cooled, and scented with a custom fragrance of sandalwood and desert rose. But for 3 agonizing months, this monument to perfection had been hiding a terrifying secret. The building hummed. It wasn't a mechanical noise. It wasn't the sound of elevators or air conditioning. It was a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the very structure. It started as a faint tremor in the lower floors, a barely perceptible thrum. Now it was a constant bone-jarring groan that grew louder with each passing day. It was a sound that frayed nerves and shattered peace. Wealthy residents complained of migraines and sleepless nights. Crystal chandeliers swayed on their own. Hairline cracks appeared in the Italian marble floors. A $10 million plate glass window on the 87th floor had spontaneously shattered, raining microscopic daggers of glass onto a vacant terrace below. The Oasis was sick, and the sickness was spreading. Jessica Hayes knew every inch of the tower's glistening floors. For the past 2 years, she had pushed her cleaning cart through its silent, opulent hallways. She was a ghost in this palace of wealth, visible only when a smudge appeared on a surface. At 41, her hands were chapped from chemicals, and her back ached with a fatigue that never truly left. But her smile was always gentle, her movements always discreet. She was the best at what she did, which was to be invisible. Her official title was Residential Services Associate. The residents, when they acknowledged her at all, called her the Help. She mopped floors, polished fixtures, and cleaned apartments bigger than the house she had grown up in. She endured the quiet indignities of her job with a grace born of necessity. That grace was for her daughter. Chloe was 12 years old, with hair the color of pale corn silk and eyes the color of a summer sky. She was a quiet, observant child. While other children her age were absorbed in video games and social media, Chloe was absorbed in the world around her. She carried a worn sketchbook and a set of drawing pencils everywhere she went. After school, she would sit quietly in a corner of whichever palatial apartment her mother was cleaning, sketching the city below or the intricate patterns in a Persian rug. She was as invisible as her mother, a small silent shadow in a world that wasn't meant for her. But Chloe noticed things. She noticed the way the security guard's shoulders tensed when the humming grew louder. She noticed the nervous glances the engineers exchanged in the service elevators. And she felt the building's sickness more than anyone. Sometimes she would press her small hand against a wall. She'd close her eyes, her brow furrowed in concentration, as if listening to a secret conversation that only she could understand. The crisis in the tower was reaching a breaking point. 3 separate engineering firms had been flown in, one from Germany, one from Japan, and one from the United States. They had brought with them the world's most advanced diagnostic equipment. They had run seismic tests, structural analyses, and computer simulations that cost millions. For 94 days, the brightest minds in architecture and engineering had tried and failed to solve the puzzle. Their reports filled 1,000 pages with complex jargon and technical data, but they all ended with the same humiliating conclusion. We don't know. The building was a marvel of modern engineering. According to every blueprint, every stress test, and every calculation, it should have been perfectly silent. The hum was by all accounts impossible. Khalid Alahim's patience had evaporated. His morning meetings in the 120th floor boardroom had become legendary for their brutality. He paced the room like a caged leopard, his bespoke Italian suits unable to hide the raw tension in his shoulders. Coffee cups and discarded reports littered the massive mahogany table. His fury was a palpable force, a storm that made seasoned executives flinch. $150 million. He had roared at the lead architect, Preston Finch, during that morning's meeting. That is the value of the contracts I have lost this month. Residents are breaking their leases. New buyers are backing out. The world press is calling my masterpiece the humming tower of terror. This building is becoming a global joke, and you sit here with your useless charts and tell me you need more time. Preston Finch, a celebrated architect from a prestigious Boston firm, sat frozen. His six-figure salary, his awards, and his Ivy League education meant nothing now. He and his team had tried everything. They had blamed underground water tables, faulty construction materials, even atmospheric pressure. Each theory had been meticulously tested and proven wrong. The hum remained a defiant mystery that mocked their expertise. The pressure was immense. The building's insurance underwriters were threatening to revoke their policy. The city's Building Safety Commission was considering a mandatory evacuation. Khalid wasn't just losing money, he was losing face. His reputation, the thing he valued above all else, was being destroyed by a sound he could not silence. In the midst of this chaos, Jessica and Chloe continued their quiet routine. That afternoon, Jessica was tasked with cleaning the executive boardroom after the disastrous morning meeting. Chloe sat in a leather chair by the window, sketching the distant, shimmering line of the sea. She was supposed to be doing her homework, but the building was particularly loud today. The vibration was a low, insistent tremble that she could feel in her teeth. She watched her mother carefully wipe down the vast table, collecting the discarded coffee cups. Jessica's movements were efficient and graceful, but Chloe could see the worry in her eyes. Rumors were flying among the staff. Rumors of firings of the project being shut down. For a single mother with no safety net, losing this job would be catastrophic. Chloe looked away from her mother and out the enormous window. From this height, the world looked like a map. She wasn't looking at the cars or the other buildings. She was looking at the wind. She could see it in the dance of the heat haze rising from the desert, in the gentle sway of the palm trees on the coast. The wind was telling a story. She opened her sketchbook. She didn't draw the view. She began to sketch the tower itself. She drew its elegant, twisting shape. She drew the hundreds of decorative fins that adorned its exteriors, designed by Preston Finch to give the building its unique sculptural look. Then she began to draw arrows. Arrows showing the path of the wind as it flowed around and through the structure. Her pencil moved with a certainty that was startling in a child so young. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind, a warm, growly sound that always made her feel safe. Every structure tells a story, kiddo, he used to say. You just have to learn how to read it. Don't look at what it is. Look at what it does. That evening, the crisis deepened. An emergency meeting was called. A delegation of Saudi investors who had poured $500 million into the project had arrived. They were demanding answers. With them was a special consultant, a woman whose reputation was whispered with awe in engineering circles, Dr. Eleanor Reed. Dr. Reed was in her late 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a non-nonsense demeanor. She was a legend in the field of structural dynamics. She had consulted on earthquake proofing for skyscrapers in Tokyo and stabilizing bridges in storm-battered regions of Scotland. She did not suffer fools and she did not accept excuses. Her presence meant this was no longer just a problem. It was a formal inquest. The investors, Dr. Reed, Khalid, and the entire architectural team gathered in the boardroom. The atmosphere was thick with dread. Jessica was instructed to remain on standby outside to provide refreshments. Chloe sat with her reading a book, but her attention was focused on the low, powerful hum that seemed to be coming from the heart of the world. Inside the boardroom, Preston Finch presented his team's latest desperate theory. He spoke of resonant soil frequencies and seismic microtremors, his voice strained with a confidence he did not feel. Dr. Reed listened patiently, her expression unreadable. Then she asked a simple question. Have you accounted for the von Karaman vortex street effect in your aerodynamic models? The room fell silent. Preston Finch blinked. His team exchanged confused glances. It was a complex principle of fluid dynamics, something most architects only studied briefly in university. It had been dismissed early on as irrelevant. We considered it, Finch stammered, but the simulation showed a negligible impact. From her seat in the hallway, Chloe's head snapped up. She had heard that phrase before in one of her grandfather's old dusty textbooks. It was about the way wind behaved when it hit a cylindrical object, creating vortices or little whirlpools of air. She looked down at her sketchbook at the arrows she had drawn. Suddenly, just as Dr. Reed was about to speak again, the building gave a violent shudder. A collective gasp came from inside the boardroom. The lights flickered. A long spiderweb crack shot across one of the massive windows, stopping just inches from the center pane. Panic erupted. The investors shouted in Arabic. Preston Finch's team stared in horror at the cracked window. Khalid Alahim stood up, his face a mask of cold fury. Enough, he commanded, his voice slicing through the chaos. This meeting is over. Finch, your team is fired. All of you get out of my building. He turned to the investors. I will handle this. His gaze swept the room and then the hallway. It landed on Jessica, who was standing frozen, holding a tray of coffee cups. His eyes, full of rage and humiliation, then moved down to the small blonde girl sitting beside her. This is what my project has become, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. A circus of incompetence with an audience of cleaners. He gestured dismissively at Jessica and Chloe. Dead weight, distractions we can no longer afford. The words hit Jessica like a physical blow. She flinched, her face pale. She grabbed her daughter's arm, ready to pull her away, to disappear as she was trained to do. But Chloe didn't move. Her heart was pounding, not with fear, but with a sudden fierce clarity. She saw the terror in her mother's eyes. She saw the undeserved shame on Preston Finch's face, and she heard the building scream. That's when Chloe made her mistake. Or perhaps it was her destiny. She stood up. Sir, she said, her voice small but clear in the stunned silence. It's not the ground, it's the wind. You're all listening for a hum, but you should be listening for a whistle. 200 eyes turned to stare at her. The investors, the engineers, the formidable Dr. Reed, and the furious, humiliated billionaire. Khalid Alahim stared at the child, his expression shifting from rage to disbelief, and then to a cruel, calculating amusement. He saw an opportunity not to solve his problem, but to create a spectacle, a way to deflect his own failure onto the smallest, most insignificant person in the room. What he didn't know was that Chloe Hayes was not insignificant, and the real story of the Oasis Tower was just about to begin. The story of Chloe's secret knowledge began not in a modern skyscraper, but in the dusty, sun-drenched workshop of her grandfather. Walter Hayes had been a combat engineer in Vietnam, a member of the legendary U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He had built bridges under enemy fire and designed fortifications in the middle of dense, hostile jungles. He was a man who understood how things stood up, and more importantly, how they fell down. After the war, he had worked for the state, inspecting bridges and dams. He was a quiet, humble man with hands as rough as sandpaper and a mind as sharp as a razor. To the world, he was just an old civil servant. To Chloe, he was a magician. From the time she could walk, Chloe had been his shadow. While other grandfathers took their grandchildren to the park, Walter took Chloe to see old steel truss bridges and towering concrete dams. He didn't talk to her like a child. He talked to her like a colleague. See that, kiddo? He'd say, pointing to the massive cables of a suspension bridge, his voice a low rumble. Most people just see a bridge. They see a way to get their car from one side to the other. But you have to see the forces. See the tension in those cables. They're pulling, always pulling. And that big tower it's pushing down, compressing. It's a battle, a constant, perfectly balanced war. A good structure is a war that nobody ever wins. He taught her about harmonic resonance, not with equations, but with a guitar. He'd pluck a string and show her how a nearby string would start to vibrate on its own without being touched. That's sympathy, he'd explain. Everything in the world has a note it wants to sing. If you play that exact note loud enough, you can make it dance, or you can make it fall apart. He told her the famous story of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, the bridge that had twisted itself to pieces in a steady wind. The engineers who built it were brilliant, Walter said, his eyes distant, but they forgot to listen to the wind. The wind played its note, and the bridge sang along until it tore its own throat out. Those weren't just lessons in engineering. They were lessons in seeing the world differently. Walter taught Chloe to see these hidden systems, the invisible forces that shaped everything around them. He'd give her puzzles to solve, not crosswords, but challenges. How would you build a tower out of uncooked spaghetti that can hold the weight of this apple? Or if you wanted to knock down that old shed with just one rope, where would you pull? He died when Chloe was 10 from a heart that had worked too hard for too long. He left behind a small house, a modest pension, and a workshop full of old books and tools. For Jessica, his daughter, he left a legacy of quiet strength and integrity. For Chloe, he left a priceless inheritance, his way of seeing the world. His knowledge became her secret garden, a place she retreated to in her mind. After his death, medical bills and debt forced Jessica to sell the house. They moved to Dubai for the job at the Oasis Tower, seeking a new start. Chloe's inheritance was packed into 2 cardboard boxes. Her grandfather's most cherished engineering textbooks, filled with his handwritten notes in the margins. At night, in their small, sterile apartment, she would read them for hours. She studied Bernoulli's principle and the finite element method with the same fascination other children had for fantasy novels. Her grandfather's voice was her guide. Respect the materials he'd written next to a diagram of concrete stress. An engine doesn't care about your diploma, he had told her once. And steel doesn't care about your feelings. They only respond to the truth. Now, standing in that boardroom, facing the cold fury of Khalid Alahim, Chloe felt her grandfather's presence beside her. She wasn't just a scared 12-year-old. She was Walter Hayes's granddaughter. And this building, like one of her grandfather's bridges, was trying to tell a story. She was the only one who had learned the language. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Khalid Al-Fahim walked slowly toward Chloe, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. He stopped in front of her, a giant of a man looming over a small child. The cruel smile was back on his face. "Well, well," he said, his voice soft, but amplified by the tension. "An expert has been hiding among us. A child who cleans floors with her mother thinks she can solve a problem that has stumped the greatest engineers in the world." Nervous laughter trickled through the room. The fired architects looked down at their feet, a mixture of shame and morbid curiosity on their faces. This was corporate theater at its most savage. Dr. Eleanor Reed, however, was not laughing. She watched Chloe with an intense analytical gaze. She had built her career on data and evidence, but she also knew that breakthroughs sometimes came from the most unexpected places. There's something in the girl's eyes, not arrogance, but a startling, unshakable certainty. She uncapped her fountain pen. "Since you are so confident," Khalid continued, his voice rising, "I will give you a chance to prove your genius." He spread his arms wide, a ringmaster presenting his main act. "Here is the stage. Here is your audience." He gestured to the stunned investors, then to the cracked window. "My $2 billion building is your puzzle. You say it is the wind. Fine. Prove it, explain it, and solve it." He leaned down, his face close to hers. "And because I am a sporting man, let's make it interesting. A real challenge." His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the room. "Solve this, little girl, and I will give you $100 million. A collective sharp intake of breath swept through the audience. $100 million. It was an absurd, fantastical number. It was a joke, a cruel public taunt. "I will transfer it to an account of your choosing. You and your mother will never have to clean another floor for as long as you live." The room buzzed with shocked murmurs. This was no longer just a firing. This was a public execution. "But," Khalid said, his voice hardening, his smile vanishing, "when you fail, and you will fail, your mother is not just fired. You are both banned from this property for life. Security will escort you out, and I will personally call every hotel and residence in this city to ensure she never works in this town again. I will make you an example of what happens when the unqualified step out of their place." He straightened up, his trap now fully set. He had turned his engineering crisis into a story of hubris. The maid's daughter who got too big for her britches. He would be seen not as a failure but as a stern leader teaching a harsh lesson. Just then Dr. Reed stood up. Her movement was quiet, but it commanded immediate attention. "I will act as the official adjudicator for this challenge," she announced, her voice calm and authoritative. "A test of this nature requires a neutral technical witness to ensure the criteria for success or failure are evaluated fairly and based on scientific principles." Khaled's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He hadn't counted on this, Doctor. Reed's involvement gave the ridiculous spectacle an air of legitimacy. It was no longer just a cruel game. It was a formal, albeit bizarre technical evaluation. One of the Saudi investors, a senior prince, nodded slowly. "An excellent proposal, Doctor. We are very interested to see this unconventional approach to problem solving." The narrative was slipping from Khaled's grasp. It was too late to back down. "Fine," he snapped, his anger barely concealed. "Dr. Reed can witness your failure. But we are adding one more condition." He pointed to the boardroom's advanced video conferencing cameras. "We will live stream this. We will broadcast this on our company's social media channels. The world came to see the launch of my perfect building. Instead, they will see a lesson in humility. Let the world watch what happens when a child's fantasy meets engineering reality." Within minutes, the tech team had the stream running. The company's LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube accounts were live. The title of the stream was simple and brutal: "An Unqualified Opinion, the $100 Million Challenge." Chloe stood motionless through it all. She wasn't thinking about the money or the humiliation. She wasn't thinking about the thousands of people who were now watching her online. She was thinking about the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. She was thinking about her grandfather's guitar. She was listening to the building sing its deadly note. Dr. Reed walked over to Chloe, her sensible shoes making soft sounds on the floor. She knelt down slightly so she could look the girl in the eye. "Young lady," she said softly, her voice for Chloe alone, "you are under no obligation to do this. This is a cruel and unfair position to put you in. You can walk away right now, and no one would blame you." Chloe met her gaze. Her blue eyes were steady. "Ma'am," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "my grandfather taught me that you can't fix a problem until you respect it. Nobody is respecting this building. They're afraid of it." She took a deep breath. "It's not whistling anymore. Now it's starting to scream, and if we don't do something, it's going to tear itself apart." "Doctor." Reed stared at her for a long moment. She saw no fear. She saw no childish fantasy. She saw the same focused, analytical spark she had seen in the eyes of the best engineers she had ever known. A gift that had nothing to do with age or degrees. She stood up and turned to the room. "Very well," she announced, her voice ringing with authority. "The challenge is accepted. Let's begin." The boardroom, which moments before had been a chamber of corporate judgment, transformed into an arena. The crowd of investors and engineers, guided by Khaled's curt instructions, moved back, clearing the center of the room. The live stream cameras were repositioned. The digital clock on the wall became a timer for a contest that was both absurd and deadly serious. The broken building waited, its groaning voice the only sound in the charged silence. Its fate, and the fate of a mother and her daughter, now rested on the shoulders of a 12-year-old girl. Khaled gestured impatiently toward the center of the room. "The stage is yours, little expert. The world is watching. Do not waste our time." Chloe paid him no mind. Her focus was absolute. The room, the cameras, the billionaire, they all faded into the background. There was only the puzzle. She walked calmly to the refreshment cart her mother had been wheeling earlier. Jessica watched. Her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles were white, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. What was her daughter doing? Chloe picked up a heavy crystal water glass and an unopened bottle of still water. She walked to the very center of the vast room, a small figure in a sea of expensive carpet. She knelt, her movements deliberate, and placed the glass on the floor. She unscrewed the cap of the water bottle and carefully poured water into the glass until it was 3/4 full. The engineers exchanged puzzled, condescending looks. Preston Finch shook his head in weary disbelief. Was this the grand solution? A child's party trick? "What is the meaning of this?" Khaled demanded, his voice sharp. "If you are thirsty, my staff can assist you." Chloe ignored him. She pointed a small finger at the glass. "Look," she said, her voice clear and calm. Everyone leaned in. The camera operators zoomed their lenses for the global audience. At first, there was nothing. The water was perfectly still. Then, as the building emitted another of its low, groaning hums, a change occurred. The surface of the water began to tremble. It wasn't a random sloshing. Tiny concentric ripples appeared, emanating from the center of the glass in a perfect hypnotic pattern. The ripples were fast, vibrating with a high frequency that made the water's surface look like shimmering silk. "It's just a vibration," one of the junior architects muttered. "We've known the building is vibrating for 3 months." "No," Dr. Reed said, her eyes narrowed in concentration. She took a step closer. "Look at the consistency. The wavelength is almost perfectly uniform. This isn't chaotic structural shaking. This is the frequency." Chloe looked up at Doctor, read a flicker of acknowledgement in her eyes. "It's a note," Chloe confirmed. "The building is playing a note. You can't hear it properly because it's too high, and it's buried under the low rumbles of the whole structure shaking. It's like a dog whistle. The sound that's hurting the building isn't the big hum everyone hears. The hum is just the symptom. The disease is the whistle." A murmur of intrigued speculation went through the room. The concept was so simple, yet so contrary to all their complex analyses. They had been searching for a beast and had missed the mosquito. "A whistle," Collett scoffed, though his voice had lost some of its booming certainty. "This is not a school science fair. Do you have any proof? Any data to support this childish theory?" "Yes," Chloe said simply. "I do. Can I please see the full architectural blueprints of the tower, the final construction set, and the aerodynamic report from the wind tunnel simulation?" The request was so professionally specific, so technically precise, that it stunned the room into silence once more. Preston Finch's jaw tightened. This 12-year-old was asking for the most complex and proprietary documents of the entire project. "That is absurd." Finch began his professional pride stone. "Those documents are highly confidential. They contain terabytes of data. You wouldn't even know how to read them." Before Khalid could agree, Dr. Reed intervened. Her voice was steel. "Mr. Finch, your team was fired for failing to interpret that very data. The girl has presented a testable hypothesis. As the adjudicator of this challenge, I am formally requesting you provide the documents. Or are you afraid a child might see something your entire firm missed?" The challenge hung in the air, sharp and unavoidable. Humiliated, Finch turned to his assistant. "Bring the schematics, the master files on the portable drive, and project them on the main screen." Minutes later, the massive screen at the end of the boardroom, usually reserved for investor presentations, flickered to life. A dizzyingly complex image appeared, a three-dimensional rotating wireframe model of the Oasis Tower. Thousands of lines, numbers, and structural notations covered the screen. Chloe walked toward the screen, her small form silhouetted against the glowing schematics. She asked the technician to isolate the exterior shell and the aerodynamic stress charts. She scanned the complex data, her eyes moving with a speed and comprehension that was unnerving. The engineers, who had spent months poring over these same charts, watched in baffled silence. To them, it was a familiar sea of data. To Chloe, it was a storybook she knew by heart. "There," she said, pointing to a section of the report. The data showed airflow patterns around the middle third of the tower, where the wind speeds were highest. "Your wind tunnel test was right. But you were looking for the wrong thing. You were looking for lift and drag for overall structural stress. You weren't listening." She turned to face the room. "My grandfather built bridges. He told me that when wind hits a wire, it sings. If you have a lot of wires, all tuned the same, the wind can turn them into a harp, a very, very powerful harp." She looked back at the screen and asked the technician to zoom in on the tower's profile. "These fins," she said, pointing to the hundreds of elegant blade-like structures that ran vertically up the building's sides. "Mr. Finch designed them to make the building look beautiful, like a sculpture. But he did his job too well." She traced a line with her finger on the screen. "They are perfectly spaced. Every single one is exactly 2.8 meters from the next. They are identical in shape, size, and tension. They are perfectly uniform." She turned to face the stunned architects. "You didn't build a skyscraper," she said, her voice filled with a sudden profound gravity. "You built the largest flute in the world." The room was utterly still. Dr. Reed stared at the screen, then at Chloe, a look of dawning, brilliant comprehension on her face. She began scribbling furious calculations in her notebook. Chloe continued, her voice echoing her grandfather's lectures in his dusty workshop. It's called aeolian vibration. When the wind from the desert, which is very steady here, blows past these fins at a certain speed, it creates vortices, little whirlpools of air. These vortices create a pulse, a vibration, a note. Because every fin is identical, they all start to vibrate at the exact same frequency. They sing the same note. It's a high C sharp. If you could hear it, she pointed back at the glass of water, where the ripples were still shimmering. That's the note right there. It's a very high frequency alone. It's nothing, but hundreds of them all sing together, create harmonic resonance. They are amplifying each other, feeding back into the building's main structure. The entire tower is a giant tuning fork being played by the wind. The science was so pure, so elegant that it was undeniable. The impossible hum was not impossible at all. It was a predictable textbook phenomenon that had been hidden in plain sight, concealed by its own aesthetic perfection. The flaw wasn't a mistake in construction. The flaw was the design itself. Khalid Alfahim stared at the screen, his face pale. The architect, Preston Finch, sank slowly into a chair, his head in his hands. He had been so proud of those fins. They were his signature, the element that had won him the design award, and they were the very thing destroying the building from the inside out. An engineer finally spoke, his voice trembling with excitement and shame. So what do we do? We'd have to remove every fin on the building. That would take years. It would cost hundreds of millions of dollars. We'd have to close the tower. Khalid looked like he was going to be sick. The proposed solution was as catastrophic as the problem. No, Chloe said quietly. You don't have to do that. That's the hard way. My grandpa always said the best solution is the simplest one you haven't thought of yet. She walked back to the screen. You don't have to stop the music. You just have to change the song. She asked the technician to bring up a close-up rendering of a single fin. It was a sleek aerodynamic blade of carbon composite. The problem is the perfect uninterrupted flow of air over the edge. If you disrupt that flow, you disrupt the vibration. You break the harmony. She took a dry erase marker and walked up to the massive screen. With a steady hand, she drew a small, simple shape on the leading edge of the fin. It looked like a small, narrow strip or a spoiler. You need to install these, she explained. Small metal or composite baffles. They only need to be about 2 centimeters tall and run the length of the fin. You don't put them on all of them. You create a non-uniform pattern. You put one on the first fin, skip 2, put one on the fourth, or skip 1. You make them random. This will break up the airflow. It will create mic balance. Each fin will start to vibrate at a slightly different frequency. They will no longer sing in tune. They will cancel each other out. She put the cap back on the marker. The whistle will stop. And when the whistle stops, the hum will disappear. The building will go quiet. The solution was breathtakingly simple. It was not about brute force or deconstruction. It was about a subtle, intelligent disruption. It was an $80 fix for a $200 million problem. It was the kind of brilliantly practical wisdom that came not from a university classroom, but from a lifetime spent understanding how the real world actually worked. The boardroom was silent for a full minute. The engineers stared, their minds racing, running the calculations, seeing the undeniable logic. The investors murmured to each other in Arabic, their expressions a mixture of shock and profound admiration. Jessica stood by the wall, tears streaming silently down her face. She wasn't crying from fear anymore. She was crying with a pride so immense it felt like her heart would burst. Finally, Dr. Reed looked up from her notebook. She had been running her own calculations, cross-referencing Chloe's theory with known aerodynamic principles. She looked at Khalid, then at the investors. In my 45 years as a structural engineer, she announced, her voice resonating with absolute authority, I have never witnessed a more elegant or insightful diagnosis of a complex dynamic failure. The girl is correct. Her analysis is sound. Her theory is valid, and her proposed solution is nothing short of brilliant. She turned to Chloe, and for the first time, a warm, genuine smile touched her lips. Walter Hayes would have been very, very proud of you. The live stream chat, which had been a torrent of mockery and sarcastic comments, had gone completely silent, then exploded into a frenzy of awe. Screenshots of Chloe's explanation were being shared across the globe. The title of the stream, An Unqualified Opinion, was now a staggering global irony. Khalid Al-Fahim stood as if turned to stone. His face was a canvas of wearing emotions. Fury at his own public humiliation, disbelief at the impossible scene unfolding before him, and a dawning, terrifying respect for the child he had tried to crush. He had staged a public execution, and instead he had presided over a coronation. Run a simulation. He finally choked out, his voice a whisper. He pointed a trembling finger at one of the stunned engineers. Now model her solution. I want to see the numbers. The engineering team jolted back to life, scrambled to their laptops. They worked with a frantic energy, their fingers flying across their keyboards. They created a new digital model of the tower, this time incorporating the small, randomly placed baffles Chloe had drawn. They ran the simulation, applying the same wind speed data that had previously caused the catastrophic harmonic resonance. The entire room and the thousands watching online held their breath. They watched the data stream across the main screen. The harmonic frequency charts, which before had shown a massive, terrifying spike in the C range, now showed nothing. Just a flat line, a gentle, chaotic scattering of tiny, insignificant vibrations. Silence. The lead engineer took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. It works, he stammered, his voice filled with wonder. The resonant frequency is gone. It's completely neutralized. The solution is 100% effective. The room erupted. The investors cheered and applauded. The engineers, their professional jealousy replaced by pure admiration, joined in. Dr. Reed was beaming, clapping her hands with genuine delight. It was a moment of pure intellectual triumph. In the center of it all stood Chloe, a small, calm island in a storm of celebration. She looked past the cheering crowd, her eyes finding her mother's. Jessica rushed forward, wrapping her daughter in a fierce hug. Burying her face in Chloe's pale blonde hair, her quiet sobs, the only sound of dissent in a room full of joy. Khalid Alahim watched them. He watched the mother holding her child, the two of them a world unto themselves. His $2 billion tower had been saved. His reputation, however, was in ruins. He had been proven a fool on a global stage. But as he looked at the quiet dignity of the girl who had bested him, another feeling began to surface, something more complex than anger or shame. It was a feeling of profound, humbling awe. The challenge was over. The puzzle was solved, but the reckoning was just beginning. He had made a promise in front of the entire world, a promise of $100 million, and now he had to pay. The applause eventually subsided, replaced by a thick, expectant silence that was heavier than the tower's oppressive hum had ever been. The elation of the solution evaporated, leaving behind the stark reality of the promise. Every eye in that room and the thousands still glued to their screens around the globe turned to Khalid Alahim. He stood alone, a solitary island in a sea of his own making, his face an unreadable mask of granite. The world's most expensive IOU had just come due, and the creditor was a 12-year-old girl in a simple cotton dress. He had two choices, both of them a form of corporate suicide. He could pay the $100 million. The sum itself, while staggering, was manageable, a painful, but not a fatal wound to his vast fortune. But the cost to his pride would be incalculable. It would be an eternal monument to his own failure, a story told with relish by his rivals for decades to come. He would be rewarding the child who had in the space of an hour single-handedly exposed the gilded incompetence of his entire hand-picked multi-million-dollar team. Or he could refuse. His legal department was a legion of the sharpest, most ruthless minds in the world. They could tie this up in court for years. They could argue that the challenge was a moment of duress, a non-binding piece of corporate theater, an unenforceable hyperbolic statement. He would save the money, but his word, the bedrock upon which his empire was built, would be shattered. In the high-stakes world of global finance and development, a man's word is his bond. Breaking it to a child on a live international feed would not be seen as shrewd business. It would be seen as pathetic. He would be branded forever as the bully billionaire who cheated a little girl. His gaze fell on Jessica, who had instinctively moved to stand in front of her daughter, her hand a protective shield on Chloe's shoulder. He saw the terror in the mother's eyes, a fear born of a lifetime of powerlessness. But beneath it, a new fire was kindling, a steely resolve he had not seen before. He then looked at Chloe. The girl met his stare without flinching. There was no triumph in her eyes, no avarice, no childish glee at the prospect of a windfall. There was only a quiet, unnerving calm. She had come to solve a puzzle, to silence a scream that only she could truly hear. The money was his complication, not hers. Her work was done, the silence stretched. Rashid, his ever-loyal assistant, took a half-step forward, ready to intervene to escort his boss from the room to manage the fallout. But Khalid waved him back with a sharp, almost imperceptible gesture. This was a debt he had to settle himself. Slowly, each step feeling as heavy as a block of concrete. Khalid walked across the room. The cameras tracked him, their lenses like the eyes of predatory birds. He stopped directly in front of mother and child. The vast difference in their stations, the titan of industry and the cleaner's daughter, had never been more stark. Yet the balance of power had never been more uncertain. "You have a name?" he asked, his voice low and growly, stripped of its usual booming authority. "Chloe," she said, her own voice clear and steady. "Chloe Hayes." He gave a short, sharp nod, as if committing the name to memory. He turned his head slightly, his eyes finding his personal assistant in the crowd. "Rashid," he commanded, his voice regaining a sliver of its familiar power. "Get Minister Alja from the finance office on the line." Now Rashid, visibly relieved to have a task, fumbled for his phone. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. The investors leaned forward. This was it. Tell the minister to set up a trust. A blind trust administered by the Swiss National Bank. Khalid's voice was crisp, decisive. The beneficiary is to be registered as Chloe Hayes. The principal amount will be $100 million US. A collective sharp intake of breath swept through the audience. A series of stunned gasps echoed from the laptop speakers, broadcasting the live feed. He wasn't just doing it. He was doing it with unimpeachable formality. Khalid raised a hand for silence, cutting off the rising tide of astonishment. He was not finished. The trust will be independently managed. "I want no connection to it, Dr. Reed," he said, turning to the engineer who looked at him with a newfound respect. "I would be honored if you would agree to serve as the trust's primary overseer. Your integrity is beyond question." Dr. Reed, caught by surprise, simply nodded, a gesture of profound acceptance. "The funds," Khalid continued, his eyes returning to Chloe, "will be made available to you upon your 21st birthday, not a day before. Until then, the trust will generate enough income to cover all of your living expenses and the full unconditional cost of your education. You may choose any preparatory school, any university, any doctoral program in the world. It will be paid for. Do you understand?" It was a masterful maneuver. He was honoring his promise to the letter, but simultaneously recasting himself. He was no longer the humbled fool, but the wise benefactor, the responsible guardian of a prodigious talent. It was not a capitulation. It was an investment in genius, a grand public gesture of patronage. His business concluded. He turned his attention to Jessica, who stood frozen, her mind unable to process the sheer scale of what was happening. "Madam Hayes," he said, the formal address, a stark departure from his earlier contempt. "Your employment contract as a residential services associate is terminated." Effective immediately, a flash of the old fear returned to Jessica's eyes. She thought this was his final cruel revenge, to give with one hand and take with the other. "Your services are no longer required on that floor," Khalid continued, his voice leaving no room for negotiation, "because they are required on this one. The Oasis Tower is establishing a new executive department, the Department of Structural Oversight and Systems Integrity, a position I have just created. You will be its first director." He let that sink in. "Your daughter has taught me a very expensive lesson. The most critical details are not seen by the people at the top, but by the people on the ground. Your job, Director Hayes, will be our eyes and ears. You will have unrestricted access to every part of this building from the foundation to the spire. You will oversee all maintenance, all inspections, all engineering reports. You will report directly and only to me. Your starting salary will be $500,000 a year. A corporate apartment, a penthouse on the 100th floor, will be part of your compensation package. Rashid will have the contract drawn up by morning." Jessica stared at him speechless. Tears welled in her eyes. But this time, they were not of fear or pride, but of sheer disbelieving shock. She looked at her daughter, whose quiet confidence had just shattered their world and rebuilt it in a way she could never have imagined. The next few days were a whirlwind of managed chaos. While lawyers finalized the trust and the employment contract, Dr. Reed personally supervised the tower's retrofitting. A team of specialist aerodynamic engineers flown in from Germany worked from dawn until dusk. They moved like spiders on the building's glass skin, suspended on high-tech platforms hundreds of feet in the air. Chloe, at Dr. Reed's insistence, was present on the command platform as a paid consultant, wearing a small custom-made hard hat. She watched them install the small metal baffles onto the elegant fins, not with childish excitement, but with the focused, serious gaze of a veteran engineer overseeing a critical repair. She pointed out a slight deviation from the randomized pattern on the 82nd floor, a mistake the German lead engineer admitted his own team had missed. On the third day, as the sun began its descent, casting a painter's palette of orange and purple across the desert sky, the final baffle was bolted into place. A small group had gathered once more in the now famous 120th floor boardroom to witness the moment. Khalid, a humbled but resolute Preston Finch doctor, Reed, Jessica, and Chloe. The glass of water, now a silent celebrity in its own right, sat in its place on the floor. For 3 months, sunset had been a time of dread in the tower. As the desert air cooled and the steady evening wind rose, the humming would begin its nightly torment. They stood in a profound silence, waiting, watching, listening. The wind rose, pressing against the vast windows with a familiar sighing force. But inside there was only peace. The bone-jarring groan was gone. The nerve-shredding vibration had vanished. The low, insidious hum that had haunted the building was replaced by the gentle whisper of the ventilation system. The ripples on the surface of the water in the glass stilled, leaving the water as placid and perfect as a mirror. The Oasis Tower was finally quiet. It was at peace. A slow, genuine smile of pure relief spread across Khalid Alahim's face. He looked at Chloe, who was watching the sunset, her expression serene. She hadn't just saved his building, she had given it back its soul. The story of the maid's daughter and the billionaire's wager became an instant global legend. It was dissected on news channels, studied in business schools, and debated by engineers. It was a modern fable about wisdom, humility, and the extraordinary power that lies dormant in the most unexpected people. Chloe Hayes never pursued a formal career in engineering. The trust fund provided her with a freedom few people ever know, but her intellectual curiosity ignited in her grandfather's workshop was a fire that never went out. With Dr. Reed as her lifelong mentor, she traveled the world studying at the feet of masters in architecture, physics, and material science. She didn't collect degrees for status or a career, but for the pure love of the puzzle, for the deep, quiet joy of understanding how the world fit together. Years later, she established the Walter Hayes Foundation, a multi-billion-dollar endowment that provided scholarships for gifted, underprivileged students who wanted to build, create, and solve the world's toughest problems. Jessica Hayes, now Director Hayes, became one of the most respected figures in Dubai's real estate world. She ran her department with the same meticulous care and quiet dignity she had once used to push a cleaning cart. She never lost the perspective from the ground floor. She knew the names of every security guard, maintenance worker, and cleaner in the tower. She treated them with a respect that bred a fierce loyalty, transforming the tower's corporate culture from one of fear to one of collective pride. She was the heart of the tower, its guardian, its soul. And Khalid Alahim was a changed man. The public humiliation had been a brutal but effective cure for his hubris. He went on to build other, even more audacious buildings. But his approach was different. He now held listening sessions before breaking ground, consulting not just with his high-priced architects, but with local tradesmen, with community elders, with the very people who would one day build and maintain his creations. He and Chloe maintained an unlikely lifelong friendship. Once a year on the anniversary of the challenge, she would dine with him in his private suite. He would present her with the most complex structural problem he was currently facing, and she, over dessert, would sketch the elegant, simple solution on a napkin. It was a ritual of respect, a quiet acknowledgement of the debt he could never truly repay. Years later, a young journalist writing a feature for a major architectural magazine was granted a rare interview with Chloe. They stood together on the observation deck of the Oasis Tower, the silent, magnificent structure, a testament to her legacy. "Everyone calls you a genius," the journalist said. "What's the secret? How did you see something that dozens of the world's best experts missed?" Chloe looked away from the breathtaking view and met the journalist's eyes. Her gaze was as clear and calm as it had been in the boardroom all those years ago. "There's no secret," she said softly. "It's just about perspective. Most people look at a tall building like this, and they only see the height. They're impressed by the part that touches the sky. They forget to pay attention to the foundation, and they forget to listen to the wind." She paused, a thoughtful expression on her face. My grandfather taught me that the most important lessons aren't found in the boardroom at the top. They're found on the ground floor where the real work gets done. You just have to be humble enough to look down and quiet enough to listen. From the highest point in the glittering city of impossible dreams, the quietest voice had spoken the loudest and most enduring truth, and the world for once had been wise enough to hear it. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference.